He set the ledger on the dresser the way a man sets down a decision he has already made, with precision and without looking at her. Jessamine stood near the window in the dress her mother had sent, ivory silk that had survived 3 moves and 2 floods and still held its shape better than most things in her life. She was 24 years old, and she had told herself on the carriage ride to Lockwood House that she would not flinch. She had said it quietly in her mind the way her old neighbor Calvin had taught her to say hard things. Not to feel them less, but to feel them clearly. The contract on the dresser was the same one she had read 4 times in the week before the ceremony. "The terms of your father's debt are settled as of this morning," Sylvester said. He was standing near the door in his wedding coat, which he had not yet bothered to remove. His voice was even, not cruel. The kind of even that is worse than cruel, because it means someone has decided you don't merit the energy of cruelty. You'll have a room, you'll have your meals and your clothing, and the full courtesy of this household in front of guests. He paused. "I trust that is clear." Jessamine looked at the contract. She did not touch it. "Very clear," she said. He moved toward the door. She let him reach it. "Mr. Lockwood," she said. He stopped. He did not turn immediately. When he did, it was the half-turn of a man who has already allocated the attention he is willing to give. "The woman who taught me to read a contract," Jessamine said, "once told me that the men most convinced they've purchased something are the ones who understand least about what they've bought." Sylvester Lockwood said nothing for a moment. His face was the kind of handsome that comes from symmetry rather than warmth. Strong jaw, dark eyes, the expression of a man who has kept everything internal for so long that the keeping has become structural. He was 37. He looked like someone who had not been surprised by another person in a very long time. "What woman was that?" he said. Jessamine looked at him steadily. "My neighbor. She's retired now. She asked better questions than most men I've ever met." He held her gaze for 3 full seconds, then he walked out. The door closed. Jessamine stood in the quiet and breathed the way Calvin had taught her, slowly, from the bottom of the breath up, the way you approach a problem you haven't yet solved but intend to. She already knew the contract by heart. She had memorized it the way she'd memorized every document that had ever mattered, which was the way her father's print shop had taught her. By reading it until the words stopped being words and started being the shape of the thing they meant. What she also knew, what Sylvester Lockwood did not, was what the contract left out. Jessamine Davenport had not grown up in poverty. That distinction mattered the way most fine distinctions matter. Not because it changed the facts, but because it changed how the facts were experienced. Her father had owned the largest commercial printing operation in Worcester, Massachusetts. For 12 years, it had been a good business. She had grown up in the back of the shop, setting type with both hands by the age of 8. Reading contracts and broadsheets and legal notices, while her father's compositors moved around her. When she was 14, she began keeping the billing records. When she was 17, she understood them. The business began to fail, as businesses of that kind often fail, not all at once but by degrees. A fire, a lost contract, a bank loan that compounded in a bad year. By the time Jessamine was 22, she understood the ledgers well enough to know they were unsalvageable. By the time she was 23, the largest remaining debt was held by the Lockwood Commercial Trust. Calvin Briggs had been their neighbor on Spruce Street for 6 years, a small, quiet man of 70, who spent his mornings on his front porch, with a cup of tea, and his afternoons reading legal documents. He no longer had any professional obligation to read. He had spent 30 years in commercial trade, before he told Jessamine, one afternoon over the fence, that he had retired early because the work had eventually required him to do things he had decided he would rather not do. He had noticed her keeping books through the parlor window. He had asked, politely, if she might look at a billing discrepancy of his. She had said yes. That was how it began. Over 2 years, he brought her problems, from his own records, she suspected later, and sometimes problems he had invented entirely. He never told her the answers. He asked, "What do you notice? What does this number depend on? Who benefits if this number is wrong?" By the time the Lockwood arrangement was proposed, Jessamine could read a commercial invoice the way a trained physician reads a patient chart, quickly, accurately, and with particular attention to what was absent. She had said yes to the arrangement for the same reason she had said yes to most difficult things in her life. Not because she wanted it, because she understood the consequences of refusing, and the people those consequences would fall on, and she had decided that her own discomfort did not outweigh what was owed to others. She had not anticipated how completely Sylvester Lockwood would treat her as furniture that happened to breathe. The Lockwood household was large and well-managed and entirely indifferent to her arrival. She ate her first breakfast alone in a small room off the kitchen, and spent the following week learning the geography of the house the way she learned everything, by observation, by asking precise questions of the right people, and by keeping her conclusions to herself until she was certain of them. On the fourth morning, she found the estate's commercial records in the study. 3 years of ledgers and supply invoices for the textile operation. Sylvester managed alongside his business partner, a man named Beaumont, who had an office in Boston, and a manner Jessamine had observed once, at the wedding dinner, that suggested a man entirely at ease with other people's discomfort. She should not have opened the ledgers. She opened them. The first 2 were straightforward. She set them aside. The third, the raw materials supply accounts, she sat with for 40 minutes. The wool purchase orders were routed through 3 separate suppliers. On their face, unremarkable. But the unit prices had increased 17% over 18 months, while the brokerage invoices from the intermediary, a company called Hartwell & Sons, showed no corresponding change in commodity pricing. She turned back 2 pages, turned forward again. She wrote one question at the top of a clean sheet of paper. Who is Hartwell & Sons, and who owns them? Sylvester found her there. He did not knock. He came into the study in his overcoat, clearly just returned from outside, and stopped when he saw her at his desk with the ledger open across her lap. Jessamine did not close it. Those are business records, he said. I know. I'm reading them. They're not for reading. His voice was quiet, not raised. The quality of a man who has not needed to raise his voice in some time because people generally simply did the thing. Records kept from no one's eyes, Jessamine said, are just furniture. She saw his jaw tighten. She had the impression he was not accustomed to sentences like that in his own house. What are you looking for? Jessamine looked at the page. I'm not looking for anything. I found something. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to the column in question. Your wool purchase costs have increased over a year and a half. Your own brokerage invoices from the same period show stable pricing. Those 2 things don't move that way unless someone is negotiating very badly, or arranging the difference to go somewhere else. The room was quiet. Sylvester stepped to the desk. He looked at the figures without touching them. He read in silence for long enough that Jessamine heard the clock in the hallway. How did you learn to read accounts? He said finally. My neighbor, and 4 years of keeping my father's books while they were failing. She paused. I'd argue that failing books are a more thorough education than healthy ones. You learn where the numbers lie because the consequences of missing it are immediate and personal. He looked at her then, fully, the way he had not looked at her since before the ceremony. It was not warmth, it was not admiration. It was the particular attention of a man who has set an expectation and encountered something entirely outside it, and has not yet decided what to do with that. He walked out without another word. Jessamine pulled the ledger back. She kept working. The household had its rhythms, and Jessamine moved through them carefully. Sylvester met with his factors twice a week, and his Boston correspondents once a month. He spoke about the textile operation at dinner, with the compressed efficiency of a man who considers most conversation an inefficient use of time. He was not dismissive of her. He was simply absent from her, which she had learned was the more persistent variety to endure. She said nothing at these dinners. She listened. She learned that 2 of the mill's 3 primary buyers had sent queries in the past quarter about the consistency of the finished cloth. She learned that Beaumont had handled the correspondence himself, which struck her as unusual. On the 11th day of her marriage, Sylvester's cousin Sophronia came to dinner. Sophronia Vane was 31, handsome and certain, with the particular confidence of a woman who has spent her entire life in rooms where her assessment of the situation was treated as definitive. She looked at Jessamine with the careful social interest of someone cataloging an unfamiliar object. There were 4 other guests, 2 merchants and their wives, all of whom were the kind of people who notice everything and respond to nothing directly. Sophronia waited until the second course. Then she turned to Jessamine with a bright smile and said, I imagine keeping books for a print shop is quite different from managing a household of this size. One does develop such particular habits. The table went the way tables go when someone has said the exact right thing to wound and dressed it in perfect courtesy. Jessamine felt it land. She also felt Sylvester at the far end of the table, his silverware moving, his eyes not lifting. That silence, his silence, cost her more than Sophronia's words. She had been in this house nearly 2 weeks. She had read ledgers that could protect his business, had offered information that no one else in his employ appeared to have found, and he had not once, in any room, given her the small and ordinary dignity of acknowledgement. She breathed once. She looked at Sophronia. "I imagine," she said pleasantly, "that all habits look particular from the outside. The question is whether they're useful." One of the merchant's wives pressed her lips together in the way of a woman controlling a smile. Sophronia's eyes sharpened. Sylvester at last looked up. The dinner passed. Afterward, in the entrance hall, the merchant's wife touched Jessamine's arm briefly. "Precisely said," she murmured. Jessamine thanked her. She went to the study. She did not allow herself to feel what she was feeling until she was alone at the desk with the ledgers open, and then she let it move through her like weather, and then she returned to the work. She composed a letter to Calvin that evening. She needed the registered principals of Hartwell and Sons, Boston Commerce, established within the last 3 years, and any affiliated parties in the wool brokerage trade. At some point she became aware she was not alone. Sylvester was in the doorway. She did not know how long he had stood there. "You should sleep," he said. "Soon." A pause. Sophronia was unkind. Jessamine set down her pen. She looked at the column she had been cross-referencing. "Yes," she said, "she was." You didn't say anything." The silence that followed had a texture to it. "No," he said, "I didn't." "Good night, Mr. Lockwood." She heard him leave. She returned to the ledgers and did not look up again until the candle had burned low, and the pattern in the figures was as clear as she was going to make it that night. Hartwell and Sons had been incorporated 22 months ago. The same month the overcharges began. Calvin's letter arrived on a Thursday. She knew it before she opened it by the handwriting. His careful, architectural script. The letters that had always looked to her like something built rather than written. He had answered her questions, and then some. Hartwell and Sons was registered to 2 principals. One was a wool broker of no particular distinction. The other was a man named Beaumont. She read it twice. Then she sat very still with her hands flat on the page, the way Calvin had taught her to sit with information that required respect before it required action. Then she went to find her husband. Sylvester was in the front office reviewing correspondence. She knocked and waited. When he came to the door, she said she needed 5 minutes. He studied her face. He stepped back and let her in. She set Calvin's letter on the desk in front of him and stood back. He read it once, then again. The first reading, his expression held. The second, something moved through his jaw that she recognized as the particular anger of a man encountering a truth he has half suspected and half hoped would not be confirmed. He set the letter down. "Beaumont," he said. "And your supply invoices go back 22 months, the same month Hartwell was incorporated. He's been billing us through his own intermediary." "Yes. The markup is significant enough to constitute fraud, but gradual enough that it would look like ordinary inflation in a cursory review." She paused. "And the buyer complaints about cloth consistency. If Beaumont controls the raw stock selection through Hartwell, he controls what grade reaches your mill. If he's diverting the better grade to buyers he has separate arrangements with, that would explain why your output has become inconsistent, while your purchase costs have increased." Sylvester looked at the wall. She watched the calculation move through him. Not the mathematics, he could do those himself, but the human arithmetic. 20 years of partnership, what it would cost to act, what it would cost not to. "How did you find this?" he said. "The ledgers were on the shelf." "They've been on that shelf for 3 years. "Yes," she paused. No one else looked. He picked up his hat from the edge of the desk, held it without putting it on. "Before you speak to Pierce," she said, "read the buyer complaints directly. Not Beaumont's summaries. The original letters will tell you where in the supply chain the quality degraded. If Beaumont wrote the summaries, he wrote them to obscure that." He looked at her. That quality of attention again, reluctant, precise, the look of a man who has been expecting one thing and keeps finding another. "I'll read them," he said. He left. The rumor reached her on a Monday. She heard it sideways, the way you hear most things in a close household, through the particular silence that enters a room, when people have already formed the thing they are now carefully not saying. By noon she had assembled the shape of it. Someone had begun circulating a story through the county's social channels. The story went like this. A bankrupt printer's daughter, newly arrived with access to her husband's commercial records, had been manufacturing evidence of misconduct in order to position herself as indispensable and to create leverage over the partnership's affairs. It was elegant. She would give it that. It was the kind of story that required Sylvester to discredit her, which would require him to re-examine every figure she had found, which would slow everything by exactly the number of days needed for Beaumont to adjust his records before any formal inquiry. The timing was not a coincidence, it was a calculation. She went to Sylvester. He was in the study, and she could see from his face when she came in that he had already heard it. "When?" she said. "This morning, a letter from a neighbor." She sat down across from him. "Do you believe it?" He met her eyes. "No," he said. She breathed. "But I want to ask you something." His voice was careful in the way of a man choosing exact words. "Your father, have you written to him about what you found here?" Jessamine looked at him. "Yes." Something moved through the room. "I wrote him," she said evenly, "because I wanted to know whether he recognized the intermediary structure from his own dealings. The supplier who defrauded his print shop used a similar arrangement. I wanted to know if the pattern had a common origin." She paused. "I haven't received his answer yet." Sylvester said nothing. "Open my correspondence," she said. "Every letter I've sent since I arrived. Read them." "I'm not going to read your correspondence." "Then don't. But don't hold a half suspicion against me either." Her voice did not soften. "Trust offered only after inspection is not trust. It has a different name." A long silence. "The rumor came from Beaumont," Sylvester said. "Pierce confirmed it this morning. Beaumont's secretary has been in contact with at least 3 people in the county." "And Pierce?" "He knew the Hartwell arrangement was irregular. He told himself Beaumont had cleared it with me. He didn't ask because asking would have required an answer he didn't want to hear." Jessamine absorbed this. "What does he want to do?" "He'll give full testimony. He understands his position here is finished regardless. He said he'd rather go out as a witness." "That's the right decision." Sylvester leaned forward. "Beaumont has a meeting scheduled at the end of this week with 2 of our secondary buyers. Pierce doesn't know the content, but the timing is not coincidental." Jessamine understood immediately. "He's trying to formalize new arrangements before we can present anything formally. He needs relationships in place that make the old ones harder to trace." She paused. "We need to move before the week is out. Can you have it prepared in time?" She looked at the desk. The ledgers, Calvin's letter, the buyer complaints she had now read in full, the supply invoices cross-referenced against Boston port records she had requested through Calvin's connections. "Yes," she said, "we can." Beaumont came the night before the board meeting. He came uninvited, at 7 in the evening, with the ease of a man who has spent 20 years treating another man's house as an extension of his own office. Jessamine was in the parlor when she heard the door. She heard the voices in the hall. She waited 2 minutes. Then she collected the document she had been reviewing and walked to the front sitting room and opened the door without knocking. Beaumont was 55, broad and smooth, with the practiced sociability of a man who has made other people comfortable at their own expense for decades. He looked at her with an expression that managed to be polite and dismissive at once, the expression of a man for whom women in rooms like this were part of the furniture. "Mrs. Lockwood," he said, "I wasn't aware you were joining us." "I live here," she said pleasantly. She sat down. Sylvester looked at her. She gave him the smallest possible nod. "My wife has been reviewing the supply accounts," Sylvester said. Beaumont's expression adjusted, not dramatically, but in the way of a man recalibrating the conversation he had planned. "Jonathan," he said carefully, "there are aspects of the Hartwell arrangement I'd prefer to explain privately." "The Hartwell arrangement," Sylvester said, "is registered to you." The room went quiet. "That's a mischaracterization. There are other principles." "One other. A wool broker of no commercial standing who has never appeared in a single negotiation on behalf of the firm." Sylvester did not raise his voice. He never did. "You incorporated Hartwell 22 months ago and have been billing this partnership through your own intermediary at a 17% markup for the duration." Beaumont looked at Jessamine. "Where did you?" "The ledgers were on the shelf," she said. Something shifted behind his eyes. The smoothness held, but the architecture underneath it had changed. "Jonathan," he said, turning back, "whatever your wife believes she has found, a woman reading trade accounts without context is likely to reach conclusions that a trained commercial mind would recognize as. The math," Jessamine said, "doesn't require context, it requires accuracy." Beaumont looked at her fully for the first time. Not contempt, precisely. The reassessment of a man who has walked into what he expected to be a manageable conversation, and found it is something else entirely. "If this goes before the board," he said, "I will dispute every figure." "You're welcome to," Sylvester said. He stood. "The documents will be presented in the morning. What you choose to dispute is a matter for the partnership to adjudicate." He paused. "I would remind you that 3 of the 5 board members reviewed the original figures before your accounts were adjusted." A beat. "I preserved the originals," Jessamine said quietly, "and Calvin Briggs, who identified the Hartwell principle, will provide a signed affidavit." Beaumont stood. He was still composed. Men like Beaumont kept their composure long after it stopped serving them, because it was the only instrument they had left, but something in his eyes had changed. The specific calculation of a man who has lost the ground he came in on, and is now deciding how to manage the descent. He looked at Sylvester. He said nothing. He walked out. The door closed. The room held the particular quiet of something that has ended. Sylvester stood near the window for a long moment. Jessamine let him have it. She had learned that he needed physical distance to work through things that cost him something, not to avoid them, but to be honest with them before he responded. 20 years, he said finally. "Yes. I should have looked more carefully." "You trusted someone you had built something with. That is the reasonable beginning of a partnership, not a character failure." She paused. "You are looking now. That is what matters." He turned. His face was open in a way it had not been in the months she had known him. Less deliberately managed, like a room where someone has finally opened the window. "We should finish the documentation tonight," she said. "The board meets at 9. He came back to the desk. "Sit with me." She sat. They worked past midnight. Sylvester reading and questioning, reorganizing 2 sections of the evidence sequence in ways that were genuinely better. Jessamine holding the precision of the numbers against his inclination to simplify. They disagreed twice, directly, and each time the disagreement produced something more accurate than either of them had brought to it separately. Pierce came at 10, and gave his account in the careful voice of a man who understood that honesty was the only currency he had left. Jessamine took notes. Sylvester asked the questions that needed asking. When Pierce left, Sylvester looked at the table covered in documents. "You've been working like this since the 2nd day," he said. "Yes." "Why?" Jessamine looked at the ledger page in front of her. She thought about what she would have said to Calvin if he had asked. She thought about the mill workers, 240 of them, according to the payroll records, whose wages and livelihoods were attached to these numbers. "Because the numbers are connected to real people," she said, "and I don't know how to look at that and then look away." He was quiet for a long moment. "The night you arrived," he said, "I placed a contract on the dresser. I spoke to you as though your father's circumstances were your character." His voice was even, but she could hear what it cost him. "They weren't. They aren't." Jessamine looked at him steadily. "No, they're not." "I knew it even then. I said it anyway." "You wanted to diminish me before I could surprise you," she said. "Not as an accusation, as a fact about whether. It didn't work." Something moved across his face. Almost a smile. Something underneath it that was more than that. "No," he said, "it didn't." She picked up her pen. "Let's finish this." The board meeting was full. Jessamine had not expected that. 5 board members. Pierce. Calvin, who had traveled from Worcester the previous day, and sat in the back row with the stillness of a man who has been patient for a very long time and is prepared to be patient a little longer. Several commercial observers with legal standing, and Beaumont, at a side table with his Boston attorney, who was experienced and precise, and would work with what he had, which was considerably less than he had started with, and he knew it. The board chairman was a man named Holcroft, 60, deliberate, with the face of someone who has presided over difficult proceedings before, and retains the capacity to be surprised by the specific form human dishonesty takes. He read the documentation in silence for 12 minutes. He asked Sylvester 7 questions. He asked Pierce 4. Then he looked at Jessamine. Beaumont's attorney was on his feet before Holcroft finished. The witness has no formal standing in the partnership's commercial affairs. The witness, Holcroft said, with the tone of a man informing rather than debating, produced the primary analytical document that identified the irregularities in this case. She will be heard. He looked at Jessamine. Mrs. Lockwood, please explain what you observed in the supply invoices. Jessamine stood. She was 24 years old, in a room full of men who had spent their careers deciding what other people's money was worth. She was the daughter of a failed printer. She had arrived in this house as a line item in a settlement agreement. She looked at Holcroft and spoke. The wool purchase unit prices increased by 17% across 18 months, she said. The corresponding commodity pricing records from the same period show no change that would justify that increase. Those two figures cannot both be accurate unless someone is inserting a margin between them and directing it elsewhere. She paused. I identified the intermediary, Hartwell & Sons, through the invoice headers. Calvin Briggs, who spent 30 years in Boston commercial trade, identified Hartwell's registered principals. The documentation is in the packet before you. She walked through the figures precisely, without rushing, without performing a certainty she didn't have and didn't need to perform. The math was the math. The documents said what they said. Beaumont's attorney said, "And what is your training in commercial accounting, Mrs. Lockwood?" Jessamine looked at him. My father owned a printing business. I kept its accounts for 4 years while they were failing. She paused. Failing accounts are a thorough education. You learn exactly where numbers lie, because the consequences of missing it are immediate and personal. Most people who learn accounting learn it when the money is still healthy. A short silence. And your source for the Hartwell identification? My neighbor, she said. She taught me what questions to ask. Something moved through the room, not quite laughter, but its composed cousin. Holcroft's pen kept moving. Calvin in the back row looked at her with the expression she knew best from him. Not pride exactly. Something more precise. The satisfaction of a person who bet on something real. The board deliberated for 19 minutes. Holcroft found Beaumont in breach of fiduciary duty. He ordered the partnership dissolved and the overcharged amounts calculated for full restitution. He referred the matter to the county courts for formal commercial proceedings. Beaumont sat with the expression of a man who has played a hand he was certain of and found it empty. He stood without speaking to Sylvester and walked out of the room. Outside, in the September light, Sylvester stood beside her and said nothing for a long moment. She let him have it. The relief, the grief, the specific exhaustion of a man who has done a right thing that cost him something real and is still standing on the other side of it. Calvin found her. He was smaller in daylight than she had always imagined him. Compact, careful. With the eyes of someone who had spent a long time watching other people make decisions, and arrived at a private accounting of which ones had been worth making. Well, he said. Well, she said. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not pride. Something more precise. You didn't need me in that room. No, but I needed you in every room before it. He considered that. Your thinking is yours, Jessamine. I showed you where to look. You learned to see. Sylvester had come to stand beside her. He looked at Calvin with the genuine, unperformed respect of one person for another that has nothing to do with social position. I'd like to ask formally whether you'd be willing to advise a review process I'm establishing, he said, for small trade operators in the county. Independent ledger review before they sign supply contracts, to prevent what Beaumont did from working so easily on someone with fewer resources to recover from it. Calvin looked at him for a long moment. Whose name on it? Sylvester glanced at Jessamine. Hers, he said, if she's willing. Calvin looked at her. She looked at Calvin. The correct structure, he said. They rode home in the late afternoon. The road was quiet, the light going long and amber across the fields. The kind of September light that makes the landscape look more settled than it probably is, or perhaps exactly as settled as it actually is. And it is only people who are hard to read clearly. After a mile, Sylvester said, Holcroft spoke to me after. He said your analysis was the clearest piece of evidence in the package, that without it, the documentation alone would have taken 6 months to untangle properly. He paused. He said I have a capable mind advising me. Jessamine looked at the road ahead. What did you say? I told him I was the last person in the house to understand it. She said nothing. She let that sit between them for the length of 2 fields. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I came into this marriage with a contract and the specific arrogance of a man who has spent too long in rooms where no one surprised him." His voice was even in a way she had learned to read by now, not coldness, but the manner of a man who has not had much practice saying true things out loud and is doing it carefully. "I treated you as a settled account on the night you arrived. I spoke to you as if I had already determined your value and found it insufficient." He paused. "I would like to ask whether you would be willing to let this become something different. Not that transaction. Something we build deliberately, with honest accounting, at a pace that is yours to set." Jessamine listened to the horse's hooves for a moment. She thought about who she had been on the carriage ride to Lockwood House in June. The woman in her mother's silk who had told herself she would not flinch, and then had not flinched. Not once. Not even when it had cost her something real. She thought about Calvin's 4 questions. About her father's failing accounts and what they had taught her. About the way numbers always told the truth, if you were patient enough and honest enough to read them clearly. She turned to look at Sylvester. "At my pace," she said. "Yes. And you'll argue with me when you disagree." He looked at her. "I already do." "Good." She turned back to the road ahead. "A man who tells you only what you want to hear is not a partner. He's a mirror. I have never needed a mirror." He was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time since she had known him, in daylight, in a moving carriage, with nothing left to prove and nothing left to conceal, he smiled, fully, without anything behind it. She saw him then, the actual man, under all that careful management. She thought, "I can work with that." The commercial review process opened in January with Jessamine's name on the charter and Calvin's on the advisory record. The first week, 3 people came through the door. A millinery operator whose supplier had been billing for materials never delivered. A young clerk who had countersigned a contract he had not fully understood. And a widow managing her late husband's dry goods trade who had been paying inflated shipping fees for 4 years, without knowing the terms were adjustable. Jessamine sat with each of them herself. She did not solve their problems for them. She asked them what they noticed, what the numbers depended on, who benefited if the numbers were wrong. Sophronia wrote from the house she had moved to in October, a letter that said many things, and the most important line was near the end. "I judged you by where you came from rather than by what you did. Those are not the same thing. And I am telling you directly, because I think you are the kind of person who prefers directness to the alternative." Jessamine wrote back, "It is, come to dinner on Thursday." Pierce left the household in November with a written account from Sylvester that described his final months as a man who had corrected a serious error at personal cost. He found work north of the city and managed it, by all accounts, with the particular care of someone who has learned what it costs to look away from a question he should have asked. Sylvester learned, slowly, honestly, without performance, to ask Jessamine's opinion on things that mattered and things that didn't, to argue when he disagreed and concede when she was right, to push back when he thought she was missing something, and accept the correction when she wasn't. She respected all of it equally, the argument as much as the agreement, because a man who tells you only what you want to hear is not a partner, and she had said so, and he had remembered it. One evening in February, he came into the study where she was working through the quarter's ledgers and set a cup of tea beside her without being asked. He sat down with his own correspondence. They worked in the same room in comfortable quiet for a long while. At some point she looked up and found him already looking at her. Not with the guarded assessment of those first cold weeks, but with the open, unguarded expression of someone who has already made the decision and is simply glad of what it produced. She looked back at him. Then she went back to her accounting, because the numbers still needed finishing, and she was a woman who finished what she started. Jessamine Davenport had come to Lockwood House as a settled debt, the arithmetic resolution of a transaction between 2 men who had not thought to ask her opinion of the terms. She had stayed, and worked, and refused to be exactly what had been expected of her, until the truth was impossible to ignore by anyone in the room, including the man who had placed the contract on the dresser and walked out without removing his coat. She had not needed his name to possess intelligence. She had not needed Calvin's standing to trust her own conclusions. She had not needed anyone's permission to be precisely who she was. She had only needed the chance to prove it, and the patience which Calvin had given her, to know that the proof would come if she kept asking the right questions. "What do you notice? What does this depend on? Who benefits if the number is wrong? She had applied those questions to a ledger, and to a marriage, and to a man who had not yet learned that the most significant transactions in a life are rarely the ones written down. She had found, in each case, that the true figure and the presented figure were not the same. And she had known, from the first time she held a compositing stick in her father's shop at 8 years old, that the work of an honest life was simply this: to read carefully, to write down what you actually found, and to trust that accuracy, patient and precise and entirely without apology, was the most powerful thing a person could bring to any room they entered.